Let's learn how to make a 2D platformer in Godot. In this series, I won't just show you the final solution. I'll also teach you why we do as we do. We'll be creating platforms, moving the player, jumping on enemies, and much more. In this first introduction episode, we'll set up our project in Godot, create a scene for our test level, and also begin working on our player. And now let's get started. First, we will create a new project using the compatibility renderer. In the scene menu here to the left, we can then select 2D scene to create a new scene for our first test level. The node here is then what we call the root node of our scene. We can rename it by right-clicking on it and select rename, by selecting it and pressing F2, or by just clicking on the name. All other nodes we might add later to this scene will be called the root's children, grandchildren, and so on. To make our first scene just a bit more interesting, let's add a background color to it. For this, we need to add a new node as a child of the root node. We can do this by right-clicking on the root node and select Add Child Node. You can also just select the root node and hit Ctrl+A. Now we need to select the type of the new node we want to add. To quickly add a background color, I'm searching for the node called Color Rect. And with this selected, we can then click Create or just hit Enter, and a new Color Rect node is added to our scene as a child of the root node. Since the new node is a child of the root node, we also say that the root node is the parent of this new node. To zoom in here, we can either use the mouse wheel, the zoom buttons, or Ctrl and plus or minus. We can click and drag these dots here to resize the color rectangle. And to change the color, we just select the Color Rect node and go to the Inspector menu over here to the right and click in the white field next to where it says Color. Here we can then select whatever color we like. I'm going for a light blue color here. Now let's hit Ctrl S to save our scene. We can create a new folder for all our scenes by clicking on the new folder icon up here to the right. Okay, so now that we have a very simplified level here, we also want to add a player to it. For this, we need to create a brand new scene. To do this, we can either go to the Scene menu up here to the left and select New Scene, or we can just hit Ctrl N. Our player is something very different from a level, so here we won't be using the same root node as we did for our test level. Instead, our root node for the player should be a character body 2D. This node is usually used when we don't want the physics engine to move the player. Instead, the player's movement is going to be defined in a script. The opposite of this would be selecting a rigid body 2D, which is moved by applying forces to the node, and then the physics engine will determine how this affects the node's movement. So select the character body 2D and create our player scene. Now you might notice the yellow triangle here to the right of the root node. This shows us that this node is missing something to work correctly. You can click on the triangle to display a message with the problem. It is telling us that a character body needs a collision shape to function properly. Even though our character won't be directly moved by the physics engine, we can still set it up so it can collide with other objects, and this is why a collision shape is required. Remember how we added a child node in our test level? Now let's do the same, only the child node here should be a collision shape 2D. Now we have a new yellow triangle. Apparently, we need to create a shape for this collision shape. This is done through the inspector menu to the right. The labels here to the left in the inspector menu all name different properties that our node has. We want to set the shape property to something. So we can click where it says empty, and then we have a bunch of different shapes to choose from. I think I will start by creating a capsule shape for now, but we can always go back and change this later. And this is a very important lesson. You shouldn't overthink these things. The important thing is to first get something up and running, and then we can change and fine-tune it later. It's perfectly normal to go back and change things several times as you're making your game. Even if you feel like you have a clear vision of how your game should be and how everything should work, you won't actually know before you try it out. So if you are ever in doubt about which option is the best for your project, then just start with one option, try it out, and reflect on how it works. You can then always go back, try a new option, and compare the results and so on. Okay, so we also need to add some graphics to our player, of course. So let's add another child node to our player's root node. This time we will add an animated sprite. There are several ways to create animations in Godot, but in this series we'll be using the animated sprite. This is the easiest to start with, and I think it will be enough for this project, at least for now. Again, we get a yellow triangle. This time we need to create a sprite frame resource for the sprite frames property. So we locate the sprite frames property in the inspector menu, click where it says empty, and select new sprite frames. Now the resource is created, but we also want to add our graphics to it. The sprite frames menu should have opened up by itself here at the bottom, but if it hasn't, then click on the new sprite frames resource we just created, and it should open up. Since this is just the introduction video, we will just be adding an idle animation for now. The left here are the animations our sprite frames resource has. Let's rename the default one here to idle by clicking on it. Oh wait, now we should also make sure that we have our sprites imported into our project. Down in the file system menu, I'm right-clicking on the rest folder to create a new folder, and then I'm calling this new folder art. This is where I will be storing the art for this tutorial project. I'm then locating the sprite sheet I want to use on my computer, and then we can import it by clicking and dragging it into the project. The art I'm using for this series is the Sunny Land asset pack from Ansimus. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. You can get this for free on itch.io. I've left a link in the description to where you can find it. I'm using the Foxy character, and you can find the sprite sheet for this under Sunnyland collection files, assets, characters, players, and then Foxy. Now that we have our sprite sheet imported, let's go back to the sprite frames menu. With the idle animation selected, we can then click on the little grid icon here. This is used when we want to add frames from a sprite sheet. We then locate our sprite sheet and hit open. Now we need to tell the importer how many rows and columns our sprite sheet consists of. This one has 6 columns, so that's the horizontal part, and 12 rows, which is the vertical parts. Now we can click and select the frames for our idle animation. It's the top 4 frames here. You can select them one by one, or you can click and drag to select all 4 at once. Once we have all our frames selected in the correct order, we can then click Add Frames. Now our animation is basically done. You can click the play button to see how the animation looks. And if you want it to be faster or slower, then you can change the frames per second here. To the left of this, there's also a toggle button that determines if the animation should loop or not. And finally, we can select the arrow with the A here if we want this animation to auto-start on load. But wait, the sprite looks all blurry up here. What we want is crisp pixel art like it's shown in the sprite frames menu. Right now the sprite is blurry because of how textures are scaled by default in Godot. To change this, we need to change the texture filter to nearest. We can change the filter for just one node in the inspector menu. However, when we're making a pixel art game, it's much easier to just change the default texture filter for the whole project. This can be done through the project settings, down under rendering and textures. And now our little fox is nice and crisp. The last thing we need to do now is to add the player to our test level. First, let's save the player scene. And then we go back to the level scene by selecting its tab up here. Now we need to create a new child node to the level's root node. Since we want to add a custom scene as a node, we can't use the node creation menu we used previously. Instead, we can locate our player scene down in the file system menu. It should have the ending tscn. And then we can click and drag this either onto the test level's root node or onto the scene view. This will create an instance of the player scene. We just need one player, but we could actually create multiple instances of our player scene using this method. To test how all of this now looks when the game is run, we can click the play button up here to the right to run the project, or we can just hit F5. The first time you run the project, you'll get a message saying that no main scene has been defined. Here we can just click Select Current if we're doing all of this from within the test level. Okay, our player is too small and the beautiful blue background just doesn't cover all of the screen. We haven't actually set the resolution for the game. But since we want to control how much is shown on the screen, we should quickly set the resolution. We can do this by selecting Project Settings from the Project menu, and here we should go to the Window menu under Display. At the top, we can set the width and the height of our viewport. This will be our game's resolution. I'm setting this to 1920 divided by 4 and 1080 divided by 4. If we enable advanced settings up here to the right, we can also set the window width and height override. This is used to determine how large the window we run the project in should be. I'm setting this to 1920 and 1080 for now, to make it easier and a bit faster to test everything. Finally, I'm setting the stretch mode to canvas item, the aspect to keep, and the scaling mode to integer. This is my default settings when I'm starting up a new pixel art project. Now let's close the project settings and take a look at our test level scene again. If you look really closely, you should be able to see that there's this blue rectangle in our scene. This shows us how much will be shown using the resolution we set. Since we want the whole background to be blue, we should then resize the color rect to fit this blue rectangle. We can also make it bigger, that's fine. Also, make sure that your player character is within the view as well. Let's run the project again. Now we should have a blue background with our player character chilling in the middle of it all. The project files for this and my other tutorials are as always available for selected tiers and Patreon. Next time, we will be creating our first platform and make the player move and jump. If you liked this video and want to see more like this in the future, then remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell and all that. Bye!